Hi, everyone. My name is Belinda Kwan. My pronouns are she and they, and I'm the Research and Development Manager at InterAccess. To give you a visual description of myself, I'm visible from the chest up. I am an East Asian woman with straight black hair, winged eyeliner, and I'm wearing a blue turtleneck. Behind me are some plants and a white bookshelf.
Hi everyone, my name is Samito and my pronouns are he, him. I am the founder of FEZIHAUS, which I like to call a label-inspired workroom of civic effort that utilizes music to bring creatives together, focusing on exploration, fairness in ownership, and well-being. Giving you all a warm welcome to today's event titled Building Systems for Change from Creative Practice to Collaborative Leadership in Arts. Today's conversation will explore the challenges and strategies of moving from independent creative practice to collaborative systems building, with a focus on enhancing community knowledge stewardship, accessibility, and addressing systemic inequities in arts, and also technology leadership within Black, Indigenous, and disability justice communities. This event is co-presented by InterAccess, Tangled Art and Disability, and FEZIHAUS as part of two projects, Terra Firma and Conversas. To learn more about these projects and partners, we advise you to look into the podcast episode description that will be featured below.
Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that the land on which InterAccess operates has been the site of human activity for more than 15,000 years. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabeg, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We acknowledge this treaty, but we're also critical about the ways in which it continues to be breached by settlers and newcomers. In this state of affairs, we commit to the work of renewed Indigenous sovereignty. The meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous folks from across Turtle Island, and we're both grateful and responsible for the ways we meet together, learn, and engage in creative practices here.
At FEZIHAUS, we acknowledge that the land on which we create is the traditional unceded territory of the Ghanaian Nation. This area, known as Jojagay, has long been a site of meeting and exchange among various Indigenous people, including the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe. We recognize that Ghanaian has the custodians of the lands and waters on which we live, work, and create. We honor their enduring connection to this place and the vital contributions they continue to make to our community. We are also committed to learning from and supporting Indigenous communities, acknowledging the ongoing impact of colonization, and actively working towards reconciliation and justice for Indigenous peoples. Our efforts reflect our respect for this land and its original inhabitants, aiming to embody the same principles of equity, justice, and inclusion in all we do. By grounding our work in these values, we hope to contribute to a more inclusive and respectful arts community that honors both the past and the future.
We also acknowledge all displaced communities who are not settlers and those whose ancestors and community members were forcibly displaced and made to work on these lands. We acknowledge the Black communities that have been and continue to be central to community building, anti-racism, and anti-colonialism here and beyond. In light of current events, it's relevant to speak up in support of Palestinian rights against ongoing Israeli apartheid. We emphatically support Palestinians' right to live without the threat of losing their homes and livelihood to the ongoing illegal and violent settler colonialism. And we join other national and international organizations and governmental entities in calling for a ceasefire in Gaza and the West Bank. As artists, cultural workers, and academics, we stand strong in the support of the Palestinian struggle for freedom and against all forms of violence and settler colonial racism. Without further ado, we'll get the conversation started. So Samito, it's here. Our conversation about what we've been working on for the past year.
Hmm.
How are you feeling about all of this?
Wow, that's a good question to start. What I'm feeling about everything, I think I'm grateful to be able to like first have the conversations that we're having and in some ways sort of try to contribute with initiatives to sort of figure out all the issues we have to face. If you ask me if I have answers or like solutions to certain equity issues we have in the arts, I'm working on it. I still don't have them. So that said, I'm just continuing because I really feel that more than ever before we need solutions. We also need collaboration in order to just deal with the basics of surviving in the arts ecosystem. So I feel I feel committed to do it, to keep doing it. It's not an easy job, but it has allowed me to connect with lots of people who are doing the same thing. So in that sense, I remain inspired by things that people like you are doing and the many other collaborators we have. So I don't feel alone at least. So I'm happy to be taking on that, you know, that responsibility. How about you?
Yeah, I'm feeling tired. I think we all are constantly in this state of striving amid fatigue.
Yeah.
Um, like you said, still a lot of work to be done. I guess I'll contextualize a bit of all of this for our listeners today. For the past year, FEZIHAUS and InterAccess have been partnering by working on projects that we individually and separately came up with, but that have a lot of crossover in terms of its focus around capacity building, that centers Black and Indigenous communities, communities of color. And so Samito has been developing a podcast and a set of conversations with different figures within the music industry and beyond to kind of identify the issues that have been going on in the arts to prevent sustainable practice. It's been a project that's about decolonizing industry practices. Meanwhile, InterAccess has been working on a project that is also related to capacity building, but with a focus on the overlapping intersections of Black, Indigenous, and disability justice communities. I have been leading that project. I'm neither Black nor Indigenous, but I come from a disability community. I am myself disabled. And the InterAccess project similarly seeks to build connections, but its outcomes are not necessarily the podcast, but rather three resource packages related to three separate topics. The first being digital literacy and accessibility, or rather tech literacy and accessibility. The second being reducing harm in new media and tech. And then the third being data sovereignty and knowledge stewardship. And all of these focusing on Black, Indigenous, and disability justice innovation. So where we've kind of overlapped is to sort of record all the conversations that have been ongoing, the workshops that will be centering the resource packages will also be recorded as part of the podcast. And the resource packages are really conceptualized as lesson plans, starting points for grounding Black, Indigenous, and disability innovation in tech. And so, yeah,
Mhm.
Do you have anything to add to that? You want to talk more about the podcast?
Well, I can add a few things about the podcast. I mean, on our side, what we did with Conversas, who's missing in this room, is that we, based on previous iterations and efforts to like sort of define what would be a decolonized, I'm in music, so we wanted to ask ourselves, what would a decolonized music label look like? And that actually got us in like a big rabbit hole, of course, of like just trying to figure out what decolonization is. And that's such a massive question. Um, so what we did was to sort of focus in one topic that we thought sort of is central to the conversation, which is equity. What we realized was that while decolonization was a very complex topic to address, there were lots of people around us in our community, Black and Brown and disability justice community leaders and artists who are sort of already embedding like concepts of like decolonization in the way they practice their art or in the way they connect with their communities, the systems they're building. So we thought, I think a good place to start would be to sort of begin having conversations with people that we thought inspired us and had a very different approach to things. So we created Converses as part of that to sort of try and not only get insights that can be uh, useful in building systems, but also highlight people who are already doing things that are necessary and important to actually change the sector individually. I think we tend to spend a lot of time spearing these concepts and big concepts around, but I think what we also needed was to actually go into people's studios and just talk with them about their processes. So that was one thing. But I have to say, Belinda, I also feel like your project, Terra Firma, was also bigger in scope, you know? So I'm going to take the risk and actually ask you a question on that I've been very curious about, although we've worked together for a year, which is, I wanted to ask you if you could walk us through the inspiration for Terra Firma and how it builds on rhizomatic pedagogies, particularly in terms of fostering community knowledge stewardship.
Yeah, that's a great question. So to sort of clarify things for the audience here, Samito's project is called Conversas, who's missing in this room. The project I've been working on is called Terra Firma. And Rhizomatic Pedagogies is a project that preceded Terra Firma. Rhizomatic Pedagogies, or RP for short, was a project that attempted to create an educational program for Black, Indigenous, and disabled artists and arts workers to learn new media. And to also familiarize themselves with their communities' previous, ongoing, and future capacity to lead in new media, both in terms of thinking and concepts, and also practical, tangible work. That came from my own experience as a disabled arts worker, realizing that a lot of the organizing tools I had, a lot of the tools I had to support other people came from Black and Indigenous elders, knowledge keepers, and organizers. And I began at InterAccess in 2020 of October. That's 9 months after COVID hit.
Mm.
I didn't begin by working on rhizomatic pedagogies or Terra Firma. I began as the education coordinator, where we ran workshops to connect artists to tech resources, new media resources, and skill building opportunities.
Mhm.
And there were three main things that I encountered as barriers. The first was that we had very little funding.
Yeah. Mhm.
So what that meant is whenever we reached out to instructors, they would often be in a very privileged position. They would be professors that were tenured at universities who could take on a workshop for very low fees.
Okay.
Um, and from that, you start to see a pattern, right? It connects to these larger histories of who has access to resources. Lots of straight white instructors who did great jobs running the workshops, but also couldn't speak directly to the intersections of tech and culture in a
Interesting.
way that was as informed as my Black, Indigenous, and disability justice centered peers.
Mhm.
Um, so there was the lack of resources and the lack of funding. The second thing was that we were reliant because of our underfunding on artists to pay for their own training. So the
Mhm.
artists who were attending the training
Okay.
were themselves folks who were already privileged to access such workshops, to pay for these workshops. And then again, of course, certain communities or folks, it's not just about communities, but individuals who have a certain level of privilege to be attending these workshops. And so not only were we limited in terms of the instructors, we were also limited in terms of the audience that attended these workshops.
Mhm.
Um, and then thirdly, there was just such a cycle of not only burnout, but the continuation of this system.
Yeah.
It just really seemed like it was always okay, let's program the next workshop. Okay, we have so many, we had a huge we had a very high number of workshops that we set ourselves as a KPI. We had 13 workshops as a target for every season, and we had seasons in a year. So that's 33 workshops uh, within a year. And in this model, we didn't really have a chance to exit. We didn't have a chance to step back and reevaluate things. Um, and my own training has really come from anti-oppression and the idea that it's not just about accessibility and inclusion, but the fact that Black, Indigenous, and disability justice communities have contributed so much to the innovation of new media, and they should be leaders
Yes.
rather
Yes.
than just being. Um, I mean, they are leaders; they're just not recognized or compensated for it or supported for it. Um, and so I really felt this was missing during my education coordination position at InterAccess.
Mhm.
This is a really long answer.
No, but it's a great one. There were quite a few gems there that I hope I can remember, you know. But I just wanted to say it's interesting when you speak about leadership of Black, Indigenous, and disability justice communities in tech. It makes me think about something that was very central for like Conversas, which was like an argument that we have is like what went wrong with DEI, what's going wrong with DEI and all these policies around um, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the arguments that I heard was that one of the problems with it is that it lacks a leadership that is actually capable of generating a tangible social change because it's mostly about compliance, right? You have like top leadership trying creating systems to comply and leaving the work to like people below them. But actually, if you don't have leaders that look like us at the top, you really cannot, um, care enough or like understand enough to sort of create a culture at the top that then, trickles down to like the system. So I think it's a very, very interesting point that you make, because as we speak, we still have issues in terms of like equity in leadership, and what we inherit is often systems that are not built to support the communities we come from or we work in. So I think is a very interesting point. The other point that I was going to ask is in regards to the 33 workshops, how big was your team?
It was one person coordinating 33 workshops. I
Oh,
don't know how folks did it before. Actually, I should clarify.
yeah,
I don't know if it makes it better,
yeah.
but it was 33 educational sessions. So
Mhm.
sometimes we would do a workshop that was 3 sessions. That would count as 3 out of the 33.
Okay, well,
Yeah,
yeah.
like I said, I don't know if it makes it any better. Um,
Well,
but
yeah, go ahead. So it speaks to this precarity in terms of, which is central to what we do, is like moving from like individual practice to systems building. It's interesting because it's like you recognize the things that need to be dealt with, but because of a lack of access and resources, you have to sort of turn yourself into like multiple people in order to build and make these different areas work. So I think I love talking about that, because I think it's very central to how we've been doing our things. Obviously, as we move, we have more collaborators, but we still have the same issues when it comes to funding and also the types of access that we can have, you know, and there is a big imbalance because the work we have to put on is massive and we do it on a daily basis. So yeah, so I'm just adding that. So yeah.
yeah, I mean, it, I feel like that number is part of InterAccess lore now.
Yeah.
It's 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 kind of this it's kind of this memory. And if you ask my peers at InterAccess, they'll probably say, I've mentioned this 33 number so many times, but it's because it's burned into my head
Yeah.
uh, about how much it was. But anyway, I wanted to pick up on what you were saying about transforming ourselves into different roles,
Yeah.
because I feel like that's very common for
Mhm.
artists to do.
Mhm.
And in some ways, it's a talent that
Yeah.
artists have because you maintain this independent practice and you have to take on all of these tasks. You're unfortunately, to put it in capitalist terms, you're your own product, you're your own company. Um, but as we've discussed throughout the year, this becomes ever more difficult um, when we try to deal with bigger sectoral innovation projects, because once we try to scale up, we realize it's not as sustainable. So I wanted to ask you, what are some key tangible barriers or challenges that came up for you um, throughout this process? Maybe in Conversas, but maybe in other projects as well, of moving from being an artist, a multi-hyphenate artist, to someone who's trying to scale up into sectoral innovation. What was that like? What were the top 3 challenges or barriers?
Well, I think it's a question that can be answered in many ways, because I think building my own company and this new aspiration of tackling these issues comes from a very, very personal experience and long experience in music, but also in academia, right? Where I sort of realized that I wasn't allowed to have my own agency, right? Generally, right? And what that meant was that, especially in music, I love music and I respect everyone that works in music and everyone that I've worked with. I've been very fortunate to find and meet great people, but I also met bad people. So what I learned was that as an artist who wanted to sort of build a career, successful career, a sustainable career, I wasn't allowed to have my own agency. I wasn't allowed to like have control over my rights, over the money, and also over my health, right? Meaning in the long run, if you're touring like 3, 4 years, there's definitely a moment where you're gonna go down. And in those moments, no one was there. And often you didn't have the money to take care of yourself. Um, so that was the premise of my work. And the premise of my change, in terms of the way I practice my art. But that was in a long period, right? It wasn't just as fast as it sounds right now. It was like a lot of transformation. I had to really stop what I was doing, which meant like stop all the contracts that I had ongoing with certain institutions like labels and booking and managers, which is already like something that is little appreciated when you do it, because I think you usually sound and look like a cocky person in an industry where most people are willing to take um, any support and that they receive, in order to make it there. Except that when you sit down and look in terms of long term, if you don't have your agency, you don't have your money, and you don't have your health, it's impossible to have a long term career. So, long story short, that was the first. That's when I started changing my practice, realizing that I had to move and create something that allows me to sort of protect myself, but also protect my art. I believe that artists have to own their art, regardless of how policies, how like the law is, like publishing and all of those things that actually began last century. So some of them are super outdated, but they still are the premise of how the music industry works. So first it was like creating a space where I can allow myself to have that agency. So it meant a place where I can explore and decide what concepts I want to build, then that I can have ownership of my work, but also be able to monitor my health, be able to know when to stop and when to work, right? And that for me changed completely because, well, while I lost a lot of support and money because I didn't have any source of like safe security at that point, it allowed me to sort of slowly build this space. And I didn't have any support at all until I landed the first grant. Like this is like probably like 3 years in, right? So that's a barrier even to get there. And it meant that I had to find people that come and work with me for funding. I had to do the writing multiple times, working with this person with all the rejections until I started having the sense of what it is that mattered and what were the things that I could do, how I could contribute. So I had to mature that vision. And just there, it takes a few years to get there, right? Um, then, I think once you get there, access is a big one. I didn't have access to the right channels, the right people, and by that, it wasn't because I didn't know people, but it's also like getting to a place where I find I have relationships that are coherent, relationships that believe what I'm trying to do, and what that meant was that I had to sort of pilot projects first and put them out, right? Iterate them to a certain extent. And then people would see my project as a serious initiative. And this is when I started meeting people like Mutech, who actually opened up to like their own network. That's how we met. That's how I met Belinda from Flumi in Barcelona, and many other people that are now sort of coming and sort of supporting. That was the second big barrier I had, like access. And I have to repeat this. It took a long time to get to the place where we are today, almost a decade to get to the place where we are. That's what this meant. The third barrier that I encountered was once I started building these projects, right, was that there was no enough funding. So you begin a project, you cannot continue it. You do the first, piloting, but then continuation is like a big issue because, you don't have the funding. You cannot just go, straight into like taking it to the next phase. So it's like you have to reapply for different funding. You have to find funding, and sometimes you reject it the first time. So, you can like the gaps between the funding are really a big issue, and the waiting, like you have to wait 5 to 6 months to know if you get the funding. So I think those are the main, barriers I found in my practice, which I'm still having to deal with today, and trying to figure out how to continue this work, Yeah.
Yes, wow, there's so much there that um I connect to, and that I'm sure, maybe I'm biased, but I'm sure our listeners are connecting to as well.
Yeah.
Um, as they listen to this, right? And it just really speaks to how many different types of barriers, and therefore
Mhm.
how many types of accessibility
Mhm.
need to exist out there. I also wanted to flag, it's an interesting position. I think especially in the InterAccess role, where we're an artist-run center and we're not always necessarily concerned with industry. We're also working with grassroots folks. Um, the code switching that is required, and I say this because I say accessibility, I say inclusion, I say innovation, right? Those are
Mhm.
the words that get funding and
Mhm.
get folks who have the resources to connect with a project. But in fact, a lot of communities are extremely critical and
About
opposed to those words, right?
mm,
And diversity and etc. Because inclusion, it connotes assimilation.
like
Innovation, it's often used in a techno-capitalist sense.
mhm.
Um, and accessibility, again, similar to inclusion, it's very assimilationist. So I wanted to flag that because um, I know you and I both, we talk in those terms, but we also are cognizant of the limitations of that. And
Correct.
that these are only really firstly provisional solutions for
Yeah.
surviving in capitalism. And then, secondly, one thing I've really learned from the projects that I'm doing is that it's very important to respect the no's,
Mhm.
like NO,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and the
Exactly.
rejections that come from grassroots communities who don't want to be involved in these types of projects,
Mhm.
because of what people have called the nonprofit industrial complex, right? Like when nonprofits say these things and do these things with communities, sometimes certain efforts of transformation and resistance are actually watered down.
Oh, totally, totally. I totally 100% agree with that. I just 2 days ago, I was talking with a friend who I was watching a panel, and it was just a little bit of context, and it was a Black-led initiative, and the person said something that resonated a lot. We have to actually normalize saying no to some of these offers that we receive because of that exact reason. They water down the movements, they water down the aspirations as well. Because yes, I think you're right in saying like when we use this language, the code switching, and um it's easy to when you have the language and you have the skills to write these grants and these projects, it's also a way for you to get access to certain things, right? That I always find it interesting at times because it's a big contradiction, personal as well. It's like sometimes you seeking money. We often seek money from the institutions that we are also built on colonization, and so it's a very big contradiction. We don't like talking about it because we always talk about money more. Money is more important. Everyone wants the money. Everyone wants to eat. By the way, an expression that I think is very toxic. Um, but there is that contradiction is uh, do you, how much are you willing to break your integrity to get that money and do these projects, right? And how do you balance that? If you have access, if you're able to go get that money, how do you balance that? How do you not lose integrity? I think it's often on the way you conduct your own projects. I've I've often sought to just stick to my values based on my experience. I think that the money that we were able to get is very important that it trickles down to other people. It's very important that it's used to support the next person that I think is super talented and can benefit from having the experience that I had and the tools that I was able to build, so that's something that I'm doing. But I totally agree with you. Just to finish, there is a reason why we focus converses on equity is because I have a big problem with inclusion, like you said, means assimilation. And I also have a big problem with diversity because when I was in music, diversity was what was used to sort of um, push me away and put me in this small bin where people don't even care about what I do. It's not artistic, it's more tourism. So I didn't want to build my project around that. And I thought equity was a much more interesting discussion. It's somewhat very impartial as well. Um, and it's something that, I think is very important. It's like how do we make systems that are more equitable? How do we allow people to have access to networks, to funding? So yeah, just to like comment on that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I as I collaborate with you, I know you agree on these things. Like it's funny because um these days I've been doing a lot of more formalized professional development, as I've told you before. Um, at University of Toronto, just to get to know people from other sectors, what they're doing, what cross-sectoral standards are like outside of the arts.
Mhm.
So I can leverage that sort of knowledge.
Yeah.
And there's a concept I mean, broadly, business theory. I'm sure there's like actually um, a further breakdown of a category for that, but in business, they differentiate between tacit knowledge and explicit knowledge.
Mhm.
And tacit knowledge is knowledge that's difficult to put into words, that is like flexible. It kind of flows through the work that you do. It's hard to document. It's really gained through lived experience.
Yeah.
Um, as opposed to explicit knowledge, which is knowledge that's really easy to put into words,
Mhm.
and has all this language that's tied to it. And I know we've talked about this several times before, but working with communities involves a lot of tacit knowledge. And but tacit knowledge is really hard to
Yeah.
sometimes um build upon in capitalism, because capitalism requires documentation.
Yeah, exactly.
It requires a strict use of language. And I think about this. I mean, it pervades everything we've been talking about, but I think about this also because you're talking about, like, let's say equity instead of these words. But in my experience, it's like all the words are provisional all the time. Like,
Totally.
move from word to word, and it's because we have the tacit knowledge to do so. Um, I'm just thinking about also this earlier panel we had, like as a part of rhizomatic pedagogies in 2023, with Kim Ninkuru and Samai Arsentalas Kahais, about Afro indigeneity, or not Afro-Indigeneity. Kimnan Kuru um, is a Black artist. Samai Kahaz is an Indigenous artist. Um, so it's not about Afro-Indigeneity because they weren't Afro-Indigenous, but like about Black and Indigenous collaboration.
Mhm.
And, you know, part of the conversation is like, you know what? Sometimes collaboration is about vibes,
Yeah.
right? And how we have to translate that to some people is that it's tacit knowledge.
Yeah.
It comes from m months, years, decades of working with other people who just experience barriers, and there's a kind of intuition that develops, an intuition of when to code switch, when to frame things differently, and it's so hard to navigate that and build upon that in capitalism and colonial structures.
Totally. And it's hard to be that person that has to do that, too. Like I'm saying this in general, right? Because you're super conscious of how things move, but you also have to put yourself in this position where you have to make it palatable. And I'm not saying this necessarily in a negative way. I think it's important so that in order to sort of survive within this ecosystem, that's what has sort of worked in a way. But going back to what you're saying about the vibe, I think I totally agree because we can throw all these concepts around the colonization and all of that. It is also about who you are, right? For me, when I think about the colonization, I also think about my parents who fought for the independence of Mozambique. So these things already exist intergenerationally, right? So sometimes you don't even realize it, but that's how you carry yourself in the world. I couldn't be exploited in music because I learned early that exploitation is not a good thing, right? So the way you vibe with people, the way you meet certain communities, and it just gels, it's also how you carry yourself and how you understand you have to respect the values of these communities, right? So I think it's very interesting how these collaborations are doing, and I think that's why I see the hope is that I see the people who are going like, yeah, we have to sort of normalize the no's. We have to keep the knowledge around, we have to exchange the knowledge between us, we have to build this thing in this way so it stays here, we have to move it here, we have to be selfless here. I think that's what gives me not hope, but that's what keeps me going. Is that in our conversation throughout this year is really an exchange. I learn from you as much as I need, from your experience and the projects you have. So, yeah, um, yeah. But so I wanted to go back to something you said about I don't remember what you said, but I have a question for you, Belinda. Let me just jump on it. Um, it has to do with your practice changing. Okay, how does your experience and role at InterAccess influence your transition from creative practice to systems leadership? I know from our conversations that you've been sort of building on that side, trying to figure out, learn more about, project management and all of that. And I have the sense that you are that person that will seek the knowledge they need in order to understand how to deal with all this mess and continuously growing and trying to find solution and understand more. So how is that? Yeah.
Yeah. So to talk a little bit more about my creative practice, I wouldn't consider myself an artist.
Yeah.
I think primarily I began as a writer.
Okay.
And because and my writing, I should also say, came from my experience of disability. I didn't recognize myself as disabled for a long time. Um, I mean, if we're talking about documentation, I only in the past year, for the first time, sought disability accommodations for
Mhm.
learning. But when I was two, my father was diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's. So for much of my life, I was involved in family caregiving. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was also depressed. And everyone other than my father also had invisible disabilities, which we did not acknowledge. We did not know how to articulate. We just knew life was really hard. And
Yeah.
that a lot of things that seemed so easy for other people were so hard for us.
Wow. Yeah. Wow.
Um,
Mm.
Recently on social media, I'll have to fact check who it's from. But I saw this TikTok that was saying how being or like having a disability is like playing life in hard mode
Mm.
while everyone is playing the game as well. And like the normative folks, the folks without disabilities, they're like, why are you having such a hard time? It's so easy.
Mm.
um and then getting a diagnosis is like finding out that you're playing life on
Like,
hard mode.
I mean, yeah.
And it doesn't get easier. You're still playing the game
Yeah.
in hard mode, but because you found out that you're playing it in hard mode, you can strategize,
Mm.
and that makes things easier. And I'm not just talking about disability proper, but the disabling factors that impact folks of color, Black, Indigenous, like folks who face financial barriers, all of those things. So I began as a creative writer because I wanted to make sense of this. And I started out, and I write about this in a Black Flash magazine article. It's maybe mentioned in a sentence or two, but I started out on Facebook notes,
Oh, wow.
right? I was a teenager, just Facebook was in its early days, and I started writing poetry, or it was like a mix of prose and poetry about the grief that came with experiencing these barriers and what it meant to care and love for someone whose life is it's counter to ableist ideas of health and progress
Yeah,
and
yeah.
celebration. So yeah, like it from that, I went to OCAD like to study criticism and curatorial practice. Actually, I initially went into drawing and painting. I don't even know why I was into art, to be honest. I guess I just liked how unstructured and abstract it was compared to other things. Like, let me tell you, in my life, up until maybe until I was like 16 and or no, maybe 15. That's when I first got my job. Like when I first got my first job. Um, I was never on time for anything. I was always late. Just that's just a little picture into how disorganized I was, how much of a mess I was because of all the barriers I was experiencing. And like nobody in my family is ever on time either. Um,
Mm.
but that part of me connected to the abstraction and abstract nature of art.
Mm.
But then when I got into drawing and painting, I was like, this is too abstract. Like, how do you even do well in a course?
Mm.
Right? And so I wanted to seek those structures of knowledge that grounded cultural criticism and artistic practice. And that's why I went into criticism and curatorial practice.
Mm.
So usually, of course, if you maybe not of course, but I think it is a natural progression if you go from criticism and curatorial practice, like you'll go to arts administration.
Yeah.
And so that's how I found myself here. And I write about this to answer your question a little bit more directly or to tie everything together. Um, I also mentioned this in the Black Flash article that I wrote, which, by the way, was the first article I ever wrote public and was published where I talked about my personal experience with disability. And I'd never done that before, and it's really scary. But
And
anyway, in that article, I wrote the main barrier for me from moving uh or for moving from independent creative practice and what I think and what I've experienced to supporting other people is that lived experience is only the starting point.
that's very interesting.
After that, you have to start learning to listen to other people's lived experiences.
Okay.
And you're equipped with that because you have your own lived experience, but it's still a totally different skill set.
Yeah,
Right?
totally.
What I think will make things accessible is not the same as what another person thinks will make things accessible, right? So that was a huge leap for me.
Mhm.
And it's one I'm still learning to navigate.
Mhm. But by the way, congratulations. I mean, for it takes a lot of courage and humility to speak about your personal experiences. You know, I think that's a hard one for most people. It is for sure hard for me to speak about my own experiences. So, and I see you talking about it in a very, very open way, you know, so it's really thanks for sharing that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I thank you as well. I think you've been very candid about your experiences, and yeah, I really look up to you for
Okay.
taking that leap, ending your contracts. I don't think that step can be understated. And I really think the world of that. I think that's so difficult.
It was one of the scariest decisions I've ever taken in my life because we were at the verge of sort of something. I had been like Révélation Radio Canada. We had toured Canada, Quebec especially. We did France, US, Germany. So to take that leap, that's how I was paying my rent, you know, and I was very, very anxious. But the anxiety that I had built up from the whole experience was a little bit more than the anxiety of not having the money. I was like, okay, if I keep going this way, in 5 years, I will not have a career. I'll hate music and I'll be in complete depression. And I had had an experience with depression in a few years before, like a 9 month, like really, really bad, like in bed, like for 9 months. And I remember that when I came out of it, the euphoria of finally feeling like I am stepping out of the hole and the fear of getting back because I realized if I stay there, I'd potentially be in the streets at some point. I promised myself that if I ever feel like I'm going down again, I'll stop. And that's what made me stop. And then I took a different step, was like, because I was asking myself, what is wrong? I mean, you have everything that you dreamed as a kid, which was like, you know, go to university in music, um, sign with a label and have a booker and have a manager. What's going wrong? Like, what's going wrong? So I was really like, I didn't know, but I had this instinct. I was like, maybe you need to go back to where you first dreamt of those things. So when I was 13 years old and wanting to make a career in North America, so that trip was a blessing because I moved away from it almost feels like opposites, like North America, Africa, you know, in terms of culture, you know, for instance, like I feel like when I'm here, I know lots of people, but I'm on my own as well. But when I get to Mozambique, I just feel like everyone is with me. That's part of the culture, right? And just having that balance made me realize that there is a different reality, right? And that reality there got me from being extremely down to like up. I started feeling better. One of the things that I did was like, I told myself, you're not gonna stay home. You're gonna go out every day. You're gonna help other people do what they doing. So support other people. Just be useful, be of service. So I did that for like many weeks, like every day, and that changed my whole psychological state. And realizing that, I was like, oh, I need to stop that stuff. I'm not going back to that place. Right. And that was the change. So I came back and I was like, okay, I need to find someone who is in a good position in music, who can help me, who can go back to those places where I have all these agreements with these people and help me get out of it, And that was a massive change in my life, a massive, like that was the single best decision of my life. Just not in regards to the space, but in regards to myself and my agency and being able to feel healthy for a long period of time. And so, just to add to that, just to give a little bit listeners a little bit more detail of how important that decision was. So, I'm happy to share that, and that's what brought me here, and that's why we can have these conversations today. That's why we can build these projects and try to sort of contribute in a way that is more meaningful. So, you know,
Yeah, I just want to say it's such a moving and meaningful story. And I never say things like that. I never say something's moving. I never say something's meaningful. Or, I might write in it,
I was
but
inspired.
it's difficult for me because I'm a cynic, right?
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think to some degree it comes from um how I was raised. I've had moments where I've seen peaks of community, like little
Yeah.
moments like that that keep me going. But I don't know that I can say I've ever felt strongly in community with folks. It's
Mm,
something I
mhm.
strive for, but to this day, I'm quite an independent worker, and I think a weakness of mine as well is that to some degree I fear community.
Yeah.
I fear community because I've experienced situations with a lot of harm where people didn't have the resources for conflict resolution, and I ended up stepping in, but I didn't have the resources, and sometimes I find myself getting stuck in a situation where I feel super cynical and feel frozen
Yeah.
in the work that I do. I have the imposter syndrome. I feel like maybe I shouldn't have gotten this funding. Maybe I'm not working fast enough. So it's so lovely to hear stories like that from you because even if it's not happening to me, it's happening to other people. And one thing that and what I mean by the thing that's happening is experiencing community, experiencing that love, that mutual aid that brings you back to the source of why you do things.
Mm.
Um, I'm so happy about that for you. I wanted to say something that I thought about earlier as you were talking about it. It's something that's mentioned by Marcelo Garzo Montalvo, who's an assistant professor of ethnic studies at California State University, San Marcos. And he works at the Indigenous Technologies Initiative at the Berkeley Center for New Media. Um, and he describes indigeneity as something that's not just First Nations specific to North America,
Mhm.
right? It's about let me actually pull this quote because I can't word it as well as he does. He says, quote, Through this work, we will develop critical understandings of both indigeneity and technology as key terms in new media studies. He's describing the work that he does. We resist definitions of indigeneity that are culturally essentialist, simplistic, or overly generalized. We also reject indigenities that rely on recognition from settler state bureaucracies as a prerequisite for existence.
Mhm.
Indigenous peoples and nations can be found all over the world and are extremely diverse. What we understand as indigenous is the transgenerational and originary relationship a people holds with their particular ancestral territory and the place-based knowledge that emerges from these places of origin. So
Mhm.
when you say these things, I probably like ran it a bit long.
Yeah.
It could really just be this sentence. What we understand as Indigenous is the transgenerational and originary relationship a people holds with their particular ancestral territory and the place-based knowledge that emerges from these places of origin.
Mhm.
And when you tell me this story, I'm like, that is Indigenous knowledge,
Mhm.
right? Like you getting to know the community, you being supported by the community, you're carrying Indigenous knowledge.
Mhm. No, it's wonderful to hear that because I totally agree with that. And I mean, I tend to, yeah, I think of this indigeneity as also like, reservoirs of knowledge, intergenerational knowledge. And sometimes we're super disconnected with them. And even for myself, like I think when I speak about my trip to Mozambique, it was like I was completely lost, right? But it made me understand something very fundamental, which was the land you come from can have a very strong sort of um, relation with you, even if you don't know it, right? So for me, it just took that spark of like, okay, go back, walk in those streets, and that was like I didn't know it was going to do that, but that's what it did. It had the ability to ground me and remind me of what matters, what are my values, right? So I think it has to do with that in a way. It has to do with that. And like I said, sometimes we're super disconnected. We're not paying attention to how we feel. But I do believe in that. Is intergenerational, and it's all this knowledge that seen and unseen, that exists out there, and the connection people have with their land, you know. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm just like talking.
It makes perfect sense.
But
And
what happens when people are displaced, for instance? That's the question that comes immediately as well.
yes,
Intergenerationally,
so
right?
actually the same text, it talks about that right afterwards. It says,
Right.
as a system of mass displacement and dispossession, colonialism has been and continues to be a radical disruption of these relationships.
There you go.
I found it quite recently while I was looking for resources for the resource packages that I've been working on. But yeah, it's such a great and pithy but in-depth text.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna riff off of what we've been talking about, and now that I think about it, right? In this podcast, we kind of need to translate the tacit knowledge into explicit knowledge, but it's hard.
Mhm.
Um, Given your experience in community, returning to where you're from, and given all these challenges, uh, what is your current definition of a successful collaborative project?
Wow. I was going to ask that to you.
Yeah, we could both answer this.
Well, I think a successful collaboration is one that I have to think as I answer it, I think is one that sort of embraces sort of a value of honesty in terms of intentions, because I think what we used to in terms of collaboration is interests. right? It's like people want certain things, so they get together with certain people so they can get to where they're going. But I think a successful collaboration for me is sort of where we can come towards one project, yes, with our aspirations, but primarily with objectives that transcend what we want, meaning that what we're working on right now is about finding solutions to ensure that a certain group of people have a certain access, have the ability to like manifest their dreams or like connect them with people that can also support them, you know, um, attaining their objectives. For me, for me, it's coming from a place where we all have dreams and aspirations, and we can actually help each other realize those objectives. That's what I'm interested on personally, because spent so many hours, so many times with no one to actually hear what I had to contribute. And beyond that, some places didn't even want to hear what I had to say, right? And add the fact that I'm an immigrant, right, to a new place. So I didn't have all the codes, all the words that you need to be able to throw to build these things. It took a long time to just understand what's happening. So for me, being able to be with people like you, to be with people like Fotar, to be and think about things, and bring something to you or to him and then receive something. For me, that's successful, because I think the core of it in the end is um in order to make it's not I think a lot of the projects that we put together are super attainable, but if we don't have the ecosystem to actually build these things, then it becomes impossible. So just the fact that, we're getting together to build this project, I'm convinced that we actually can create something completely different and useful. So that's for me, that's already successful, especially coming from a place where we didn't have that. I think our stories have to mean something, right? Sometimes I have to remind myself, my story is very unlikely. Like I'm this 11-year-old kid who grew up in Maputo who loved Michael Jordan because one day, like a kid from school said, "Hey, I play basketball. Do you want to come to my practice?" And then I fell in love with basketball. And I started having these ideas that one day I would be someone. I just have to do this and that and that. So sometimes I have to remind myself, like, that's what I chased since I was 11 years old. And that's what actually brought me here. And being able to do these projects today, sometimes I'm like, oh, wow, it's been a long, long path. When you tell me about your story, for me, it's success to be able to understand the limitations and to actually translate yourself out of that situation that you grew up in. These are things that can numb people for generations, right? So for me, I have to remind myself that's my success. That's what makes me wake up the next day, go, okay, I'm going to continue working on this. So I don't have crazy definitions of success, like, having $1 billion or like $1 million. But what I'm doing right now, I remember when I couldn't do it,
Mhm.
you
Yeah,
know.
what a great quote, and what a great explanation and approach to success. Picking up on just a few things, the importance of keeping in mind the bigger picture, the objectives that transcend our project specific deliverables. Um, Success being forging new relationships and sustaining valuable existing ones. And success also being able to understand the limitations and then being able to articulate yourself out of them. I think
Mm-hmm.
those are all very, very great
I
definitions.
love how you like, just pick them up and like made them like so clear. That's yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's that practice, I guess, of translating tacit into explicit knowledge. I mean, that those two words are really, really in my head because they truly encapsulate a key challenge that I've been facing,
Mhm.
especially in a larger scale project like this, right? Because once you start moving into greater funding, you're expected to talk about KPIs, you're expected to talk about benchmarks with percentages and quantitative um, values assigned to them. And I think too, it's talking about the sustainability bit. You know, many of us move in and out of the arts frequently in order to survive.
Exactly. Exactly.
Um, but it's like when I try to move out of the arts, in the moments that I do, it's like, well, where's the quantitative stuff?
Mhm,
Right?
mhm.
They don't really care that you piloted new systems. They want to see the percentage of improvement.
Yeah.
And it's very jarring um, to navigate that. And sometimes in the attempt to code switch,
Yeah.
sometimes you forget your origin.
No, you do.
I experience that a lot myself. Sometimes I forget the importance of community as I'm working and I fear it. Like I was saying, I dread it because I'm in that sort of more capitalist colonial mindset of like community is risk. Community is like the harm that I've experienced, but it's not true at all. It's just it's what I think in the moments of forgetting what
Yeah.
matters. And I think you have such a talent for storytelling, and tying those personal experiences because as much as I can write grants and, synthesize information, which, is good for moderation,
Yeah.
when I forget the stories, then the cynic comes out, in an unhelpful way. So I truly appreciate your ability to kind of recenter it on that.
Can I throw that question back a little bit? Like, what is success for you within that context, of your work as well? Because yes, I get that, sometimes, you forget that, but I look at the projects that you built super centered on like knowledge stewardship, which for me is an amazing value, to want to share knowledge because knowledge is key, for many things. So what is success for you? I know that's not an easy work, and especially if you're acting as an arts administrator or bureaucrat, it's like it's really hard for us to understand the challenges that you face, and when do you think you've been successful?
Yeah. I think it's I mean when the question first came up, I was like, I have an answer. Right? That's kind of how I am. I usually have initial thoughts that are ready to go, but then someone says something and I'm like, wait a minute. Right? The self-doubt, the self-criticism kicks in.
Mhm.
I really like the model of success that you've laid out. This idea that uh as long as we build a foundation that will take us forward.
Mhm.
Um, and saying this in the most expanded way possible. Maybe taking something forward is stepping some things back, right? But moves us closer to our objective, no matter how small. Um, I like that. I think though that what's coming up for me right now is how much I doubt success as a measure sometimes. And how success has been reinscribed as such an ableist concept.
Mhm.
Um, because that's, to be frank, like that's the mode that I'm in right now. I feel very torn between being able to talk about this project in a capitalist way that will secure more funding, that will help it keep going, that will keep me employed in a sustainable way. And that's the survival instinct in me coming
Mm.
out, right? Um, and then there's the side of success that you talk about, right? And sometimes because I'm between stakeholders, it's like it's hard for me to not get lost in
Yeah.
terms of where I stand. Because I think that's my experience of art in general. Um, I've kind of art and life, right? Not to be cheesy, but um, I feel that I've always survived by being a bit of a chameleon.
Mm.
So in doing that, there are things that move me and there are things that I can recognize as meaningful, but I often find myself like just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So when you ask me what success is, I'm like, depends, right? Depends who's asking, depends whom I have to translate that success into because I'll say this, like I feel under a lot of pressure with this project.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
feel under a lot of pressure to deliver on the quantitative KPIs. And then I also feel a lot of pressure to say screw the KPIs, right? Um, in my own in my own thinking too, like I have a lot of guilt. Like maybe success is resolving that guilt of why was I the one to receive this funding, right?
Mm.
Because in my slowness, in my disability, like I still feel very behind on the project. I think about, oh, I could have hired so many more people earlier on. Um, so I don't know, like talking through all this, maybe success is resolving the guilt, right? But maybe not, because I think if there's anything I've learned in doing this project and this portfolio in general, from rhizomatic pedagogies to um, Terra Firma, it's that you have to balance the critical with inspiring.
Mm.
Right? We can never just lean towards one thing. Like people, I mean, I think on one hand about Eve Tuck's letter to communities suspending damage, about um, how she calls for a break or a moratorium on research that talks about trauma and the
Mm.
oppression that First Nations communities has experienced because we need to take a pause and sometimes we need to talk about the inspiring moments and we need to talk about the things that make our dreams come true and the things that make our dreams recognizable to us. Um, but at the same time, talking about the trauma is also important.
Mm.
And in my perspective too, thinking about like my fear, right? Where I feared feedback, critical feedback about how this program's not accessible enough. This program is not doing enough to decolonize. This program is maybe I'm neither Black nor Indigenous. Why am I leading a project on Black, Indigenous like solidarity, right? Um, and I mean, I think where I'm at now is that both sides are important.
Yeah. Mm.
Like, as long as you can build on what was done in the project, or learn from it.
Mm.
You may not need to, or it may not be that you're actually taking the deliverables and adding to it. It may be that you're trashing the deliverables because they weren't good or they cause harm. But as long as it brings you into a direction, like it propels you into a direction instead of stopping the work,
Mm.
I think that may be a success. Maybe.
Yeah. No, that's thanks a lot for the answer because yeah, no, totally. And I hear you, and I thought it speaks to something we've been discussing this week, in our past meeting. We discussed last week in our past meeting. which is also, yeah, how we need to come up with tangible deliverables in these projects, right, that are funded. And sometimes we spend a lot of time producing things and creating things, but then in the end, we don't have enough funding to like actually come up with really tangible, that's when we spoke about, budgeting for like corporations and stuff and being mindful of that and how in arts, because our experiences are mostly based on producing, we often don't think about the future, right? Or like how we're going to run the project, and in the future. Where you headed with Terra Firma? That'll be my next question. What do you see? What's the future of that?
Yeah, I have mostly turned to looking at what exists. Even for Terra Firma, um, it's not about producing new Black, Indigenous, and disability justice knowledge. It's about looking at the knowledge that exists and foregrounding it and then connecting the knowledge together. And in the same way, I see Terra Firma um, as a step toward other people doing that, to turn people to the existing practices and good work that Black, Indigenous, and disability justice communities have, and incorporate that more into their practice. My goal is really for people to take these resource packages and these workshops to look inwardly at their current work, whether they're an artist or an arts worker or a leader at an arts organization, and say, hey, what is missing right now that already exists? Because a key thing about Terra Firma is that, yes, it acknowledges the importance of living knowledge and collaborating with living Black, Indigenous, and disability justice figures, communities, but most people actually aren't even ready for that.
Mhm.
They haven't even, to rehash a corny word, they haven't done the work, right? How are you going to reach out? I mean, you could, but I think a lot of people reach out, they're like, oh, we want to consult with an Indigenous elder. They have not informed themselves of how to do that. They have not, they have no conflict resolution uh, policies or framework for working with communities. They um, don't have fair compensation models. So my hope is that the resource packages can offer several starting points for people
Mhm.
to work with the existing resources and knowledge to adapt or change what they're doing.
Mhm.
Yeah, instead of producing something new, instead of like saying,
Mhm.
oh, this is
Mhm.
like a pilot. I mean, it might still be a pilot, but it's taking existing resources and mapping them differently rather than creating new resources.
Yeah, which is super, super interesting. As we speak, I'm like, okay, yeah, this makes a lot of sense because these are even parts of our own projects that we still don't have them, and that's something that needs to be sort of implemented, in the short, medium, term, So yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. Oh.
I mean, we are in talks about the future ourselves, right? You and I, about like how we can um pass this off to other people or how we can write grants to continue the work. And I think two things stand out to me. First, it doesn't have to be us that continues the work.
Yeah,
Could
yeah.
pass it off to other
Mhm.
folks. Um, yeah. I wanted to also bring up like something that we talked about, um, I guess in our previous meeting, which is that we have so many conversations. Where are the projects where we analyze the content of those conversations, right? The
Yeah,
conversations happen and then they're just documented. But
yeah,
like, let's create projects where we look at the conversations that were already had.
yeah, yeah. No, totally, totally. The insights and all of that. That's been a very big challenge even from a personal place, right? As an artist, is like, yeah, we sometimes like we create so much uh documentation, so much content, but actually going through that is something that is not embedded in the organization, in the budgeting, you know. So obviously it's my own my bad, right? But it's something that I'm trying to like sort of begin um not thinking about, but really implementing like thoroughly. Like, that's a big part of it. We need help in that space, in that middle space, right? To analyze all these things, to create materials with it as well, just beyond the transcription, like go over the conversations we had, like talking about, for instance, like decolonization, or like trying to build a framework for a decolonized music label. Okay, let's go back to the conversations we had and let's analyze what everyone said and build values around those things. But not only that, but figure out how can we involve the people we had conversations with in this initiative, because so it's not just an extractive practice, right? So that's something that I've been thinking about quite a lot these days, But what's interesting is that it's all funding dependent, right? It's like I cannot just wake up and just do it. I wish I could. There's certain things that, yeah, I will, but it's like, let's say like, okay, I have like, I don't know, like 5 years of video editing that I have to do. Yeah, I can go like, okay, the next 3 months, if I'm able to like pay my rent and a little bit of food every day, I'm just gonna dive in but I'm trying to get out of that. We need help, we need structures to like deal with these materials on a constant basis and actually channel them to the places where they need to go. If we're talking about supporting our surroundings and the people around us, people have to have access to that knowledge. So that's something that's like a sort of the next frontier to me in terms of how I do my work, is like take those materials, analyze the insights, and see how they can be useful to us and other people. So yeah.
Yeah, to be pithy about it, it's like whether we need to build or dismantle, we got to look at the structure that we're building or dismantling first.
That's so interesting. That's so well said.
And we don't we I feel like there's not a lot of opportunity to do that usually. It's like we're just holding the tools and
Yeah.
doing
But I wonder how many of the oppressive systems would allow you to go in and see and like analyze them. There's that too. There's a lot of opacity in that, but it actually makes a lot of sense. We need to be able to see and study those and understand them. So, well, maybe that's something we need to tell. I'm being greedy
funders. Yeah.
now.
I the funny thing is it's I think it's all about the code switching. Because like what I've really found is that there's already language for that in the capitalist colonial world. They don't approach it in the best way,
Yeah.
right? But if you use the language, it's then you can kind of get in there, right? And that's kind of how I've been doing it. But I also wanted to give the disclaimer, that's only how I do it. I think a plethora of approaches is needed.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, like I don't play the I don't think I do, but I don't play the agitator role. There's
Yeah.
some folks who completely reject the system, see what we're doing as assimilationist, and those perspectives I think are valuable as well. The
Mhm.
folks who criticize us for working within the system, like it's a constant discipline for
Yeah.
me to accept that feedback, and it's not just feedback but like accept that that happens, and accept that as a completely valid approach as well.
Yeah.
um
Just riffing off that last point you made, I also think it takes a lot of discipline to be who you are, who I am, because it also means that you can be in the middle, in terms of like being able to speak to certain things that most people are not there yet or they can't speak on. When it comes to funding, I think it's such an important whether with all the contradictions with it, it's actually what allows my practice to continue a little bit. And it's not like I'm playing shows and I'm touring. No, it's like, I'm not even doing that because there's no enough work, but I've been able to sort of create these projects where I bring other people on board and we're able to like, build our ideas and create spaces where we can make music in a time of lots of precarity in the art sector, So I think it takes a lot of discipline to do that. And I've learned a lot from that process, and I'm pretty sure you too. So just to leave it at a balanced place, So yeah. But I'm very happy with our conversation. It's been like a great pleasure to work with you and, build. So I look forward to continued work.
Yeah, and likewise. Um, so I mean the work continues. I guess to our listeners, I hope this conversation has been meaningful to you and that this is something that's encouraging to you in the work that you do, encouraging or challenging. I think those are um two faces of the same coin, right? Because it either way it propels you forward. It either tells you to keep going or it tells you, hey, like it's time to reevaluate. And I think this is our last more discursive conversation too, right? Because the other recordings will be the workshops. And so thank you, Samito, for working with me, and thank you, FEZIHAUS, for working with InterAccess. And we'll
Thank
close
you.
it there.
Yeah, it was a pleasure, Thanks. You also brought a lot to me, so I appreciate it.